Hi, I'm Tamara, and this is TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Hi, everyone. June is National Indigenous History Month, and today we're welcoming back First Nations consultant and entrepreneur Chastity Davis. She's chatting about Indigenous women's health. It's a fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Hi, Chastity. It's so good to see you.
Hi, Tamara. Wonderful to see you too.
So I think I should just start by explaining that the last time you were on this podcast, I want to say it was a couple of years ago. I don't know exactly, but it was about a couple of years ago. And in that time, you and I sparked a friendship. So I'm having you back now as a friend and somebody who I look to as, a real a mentor in how to be a better person, really, and how to be more accepting. And as we all work towards reconciliation and relationships, right? This is about relationships.
Definitely. Yeah, it's about better relationships and I think truth and reconciliation, right? Having the truth, being able to be a truth teller, tell people the truth from an Indigenous lens, and then be able to choose better and how we're in relationship together.
So a lot has changed since you've been on the podcast. You've been married now. You've had a wedding and a baby.
Yes.
And you started a new project where you were looking at reconciliation through the lens of Indigenous women, and you had this program that ran for a couple of years, and it was amazing. I think you changed a lot of lives through your course. So before we get into your new focus, because it's always been a focus of yours, but we want to talk about maternal care and what it's like for an Indigenous woman in this province to have a baby and be a mother. But can you just talk a little bit about why you started, Canada's history through the lens of Indigenous women?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. And what I've been working in the field of Indigenous relations and truth and reconciliation for about 15 years. And I started kind of grassroots working in community engagement, and I've worked in over 100 of the First Nation communities here in British Columbia and many across Canada and the world. So what I've noticed and observed over that time is that many non-Indigenous people, many non-Indigenous Canadians didn't know the history of our country as it relates to Indigenous peoples. What we were taught in grade school from K to 12 was not very much, to be completely honest. And the stuff that we did learn was bias. So the majority of Canadians have no idea what's happened in Canada, no idea about the Indian Act, no idea about residential schools until recently, no idea about Indian hospitals and Indian day schools, and sterilization of Indigenous women, and the legislative decisions that were made back in the 1800s to control and oppress Indigenous people that are still alive and well today in 2023 through the Indian Act. And which has also led to the targeted oppression of Indigenous women and girls and two-spirit and gender diverse individuals. And so we have this national tragedy of thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirit and gender diverse relatives. That is a direct result of legislative decisions that targeted them and displaced them from their rightful roles as matriarchs in the communities, that displaced them from their communities, period. And also, equally as important, what those decisions, those legislative decisions have done was deeply ingrain a dominant narrative in this country that the value of Indigenous women's lives are less than mainstream women's lives. And so I really saw that on my journey in my career over 15 years. that, we didn't know our, some people call it our true history, but I call it our shared history, and didn't know the impacts on Indigenous women. And when we do learn about this, up until recently, it's not usually Indigenous women telling the story. It's other people that are telling the history. And so that's why I got really interested in and passionate about creating the DN platform that's accessible online for folks to learn about Canadian history through an Indigenous woman's lens. And as you're right, we had thousands of people go through those 2 years. I've paused and taken a break due to being pregnant and being a new mom, but we are going to be relaunching here this year a couple of cohorts, and we've been doing some work in the background, working with companies to customize training programs for them, so that it's not, like a public offering, but it's we've been designing and doing things for companies on the back end. And that's important because I think that if we wait for government, we'll be waiting forever. And I think that corporations are starting to wake up to, like, we have influence here and we need to be making change and being a part of the truth and reconciliation movement. And I think corporations don't give themselves enough credit in how they influence government and how they influence our society and how they can influence the dominant narrative of shifting from, the old stereotypes of Indigenous peoples and women and two-spirit and gender diverse individuals and girls, that they have a large platform to be able to influence shifting that dominant narrative, to start looking at equality, to start looking at better relations, to start looking at improving the quality of life. And we hear that, like, Canada's the best country in the world to live in unless you're an Indigenous person. That has been our reality. And I really feel that Canada will reach its full potential when Indigenous peoples have the opportunity to as well.
I mean, I feel like, well, I know that my life was changed by taking that course, 100%. I learned things that I had no idea about. And I consider myself, a pretty, I kind of know what's going, I feel like I, know what's going on. But wow, my eyes were opened from, as you say, a different perspective, the real perspective from Indigenous women. So when I feel like there's been a shift, a positive shift, I also feel like we have a long way to go. When it comes to Indigenous women in healthcare settings, there's been some pretty traumatic stories that we've read or seen in the last few years, especially in the last couple of years. We've seen some pretty traumatic ones, and those are just the ones we've heard about. Would you say that, is there discrimination in healthcare in Canada?
For sure. Yeah.
What does it look like, Chastity? Like, can you explain what it looks like? So if somebody's listening, they're like, no, there's no discrimination in healthcare.
Yeah. I think that, always going back to my core is about sharing a little bit of the history, and that's the Indian hospitals systems that operated in Canada for over 100 years. So they opened in the early 1900s, and the last one closed in 1996, the same year as residential schools. And these were ethnically segregated, federally funded Christian and Catholic Church operated institutions. For the time that those Indian hospitals were open, Indigenous peoples were not allowed to access the mainstream healthcare system. We were turned away. there's a story that one of the elders shared with me in my husband's community, in the Chilcotin community, and they're about an hour and a half outside of Williams Lake. And before the Indian hospital was built in their community, her mother was sick. Now, there's a hospital in Williams Lake, but they weren't allowed to access healthcare in Williams Lake because they were Indigenous. They were sent to the Indian hospital in Nanaimo. So they had to drive 7.5 hours to Vancouver. And this is like, in the 50s. Drive 7.5 hours to Vancouver, get on a ferry, and go to the Indian hospital on Vancouver Island to access healthcare. So when you ask what it looks like and the roots of systemic racism of Indigenous people in the healthcare system are rooted in this Indian hospital institution that operated for over 100 years. That's one story of thousands. Currently, there is a class action lawsuit that Indian hospital survivors have against the federal government. That started in 2018, and that likely will take about a decade to settle. And we're not hearing about any of this in the news. And so, when we look at the systemic racism and discrimination in the healthcare system, the roots of it are the Indian hospital system and this really deeply ingrained notions and stereotypes, negative stereotypes of Indigenous people in the country that were created by the Indian Act and are still alive. So it looks like today that, I present as an Indigenous woman, right? Which means I look like an Indigenous woman if you were to see me walk down the street or walks in somewhere. And my experience going into hospitals, which is very rare, like I'm a healthy person and take care of myself, but the couple of times that I've had to go prior to pregnancy is, I had a migraine and I was working in Smithers and I went to the hospital. And the second question after she asked me for my ID, the second question the check-in person asked me in ER was, how much have you had to drink today? And that is the question I get asked almost every time I enter a hospital.
No.
Yes. How much have you had to drink today? And so, just right off the bat, as soon as you enter the hospital, you're entering into a system that has these deeply ingrained beliefs.
I've never been asked that when I've gone to emergency. I've never been asked that when I've gone to a healthcare setting. And, the question you have to ask yourself, if someone's listening to this is, have you ever had that happen to you? Because you've gone in because you've had a migraine. You know what I mean? Like that right there, that one question, that is not a necessary question for somebody who's coming in with a migraine.
Right.
How many, how many drinks have you had is not, oh my goodness,
yeah.
Chastity.
Yeah. So that's my experience. What it looks like overall is that, we're still not receiving equitable healthcare as Indigenous peoples in this country. And I know that internationally, we're known as Canada to have this universal healthcare system. And you remember back when Obama was president and he was trying to integrate Obamacare in the US and all these Americans, when Trump got in, we're moving to Canada. They take care of their people for the universal healthcare system. And that's true unless you're an Indigenous person. It's all these things are true unless you're an Indigenous person in this country. And we've been denied access to the mainstream healthcare system up until the 1970s. And we're sent to these Indian hospitals. If we showed up at a hospital during that time, we'd be turned away. And so I think that is those notions are still alive and well today. And as you mentioned, those stories that, recent stories of Indigenous women in the healthcare system that we hopefully all know about, the mistreatment of Indigenous women in the healthcare system. That's, like you said, that's what we know about. I'm sure it's happening all the time. Anytime I'm out in community, I was just in Prince George in a community engagement session last week, sitting with Indigenous women from all over the North. And that's what came up. Every single Indigenous woman that I talked to had a racist experience within the healthcare system in this province. I don't know an Indigenous person who hasn't. That's how prevalent it is. And sometimes it's life and death.
Yes, of course. You're not going to the emergency department because you're feeling great and you just want to like stop by.
No.
It's an emergency.
Yeah.
Your healthcare is, and we always say, you don't have anything unless you have your health. Like, wish you good health. Like everything's about your health, right? When you can't access healthcare in your community in an equitable way, we have a serious problem. And I do know that with Indigenous women, it is a completely different experience for anybody compared to anybody else in the country. For somebody who's listening and has no idea what a birth alert is, can you explain what a birth alert is?
Yeah, I can. And they were apparently supposed to be stopped in this country or in this province. I'm thinking like 3 or 4 years ago, but I'm hearing that they're still happening. So a birth alert is what happens when it's supposed to be any woman that goes into the hospital and is deemed as high risk. And that means that they're like unfit, they're seen as unfit mothers. And the hospital will make a phone call to the ministry and say that, we have this high, quote unquote, high risk woman in the hospital and she's about to give birth. And we want to let you know that that this is happening so that you know that you can come apprehend the child as soon as they're born. So that's what in lay person's term, a birth alert is. And for Indigenous women, the birth alert has had a huge impact on our people. Given the discussion we just had about stereotypes of Indigenous women in the healthcare system. And so right off the bat, the birth alerts are of higher percentage-wise for Indigenous women than non-Indigenous women. And they take the child like right after birth. And so the mom doesn't get to meet the child. I don't know if the listeners who have had given birth to children, like how important that like instant bond and connection is with your child. And so this has been going on for decades, that the discrimination of Indigenous women giving birth to their child in the hospital, where they're supposed to be safe, where they're supposed to be well cared for, where it's supposed to be a joyful time for them, and they're exposed to this birth alert and their child being ripped out of their arms like right after it happens.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's been proven that trauma starts. Trauma. Well, we have intergenerational trauma, right? And the trauma from being ripped from your mother's arms, not only on the mother, but on the newborn baby. It is that is trauma that is with you forever, whether you know it or not. And I would think that we are in a place right now in 2023 where we do everything we can to keep mothers and babies together, because we know it's the best thing for the baby. So what are we doing to support those mothers, right? Instead of just coming in and taking them away. I mean, I could talk for weeks about this because it's a real, like you, it's a real concern and a real passion of mine to, really expose it, Chastity, because I think a lot of this is it's been swept under the rug for so long, and that we've been brainwashed to believe that Indigenous women aren't good mothers. Right?
Yep.
I mean, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
Well, they must have a reason for taking that baby away. They wouldn't just take a baby away. They wouldn't just do that unless, the mother was really unfit. Well, we know that's not true. So there was, I would think that being an Indigenous woman and you're ready to have a baby, I would think the hospital would be the last place I would want to go to have my baby. So what does an Indigenous woman do if she finds herself in this situation where she and I've seen these stories of Indigenous women in the hospital with their own mothers, and someone's rolling the camera on their phone to show the discrimination that's happening right in the birthing room, right in the hospital room. So we are starting to see these things now because of the fact that we all have a camera in our hand now, thank goodness, and we can point this out. But what do Indigenous women do if they don't want to go to the hospital to have a baby?
Well, I think there's a spectrum of options. There's like from one end of the spectrum to like the free birthing. I don't know if you've heard of that term, but the free birthing world, where Indigenous women are just like going out onto the land and reclaiming the traditions of just like doing it on their own.
Wow, that would be really hard.
Yeah.
Like having had 3 kids, I'm trying to imagine myself doing that, and I'm like, oh boy.
Right. So there's that end of the spectrum where there's this whole free birthing world, where they have the grandmas and the aunties and the doulas around to help them, because they're just like, I'm not exposing my child to a Canadian institution, right? To the spectrum of like where Indigenous women are going into the hospital, but they're bringing their own healthcare team with them, right? Like a doula, midwives. There's one Indigenous midwife team through the Huckleberry, they're called the Huckleberry team through the Pomegranate Midwife Center in East Vancouver. And they specialize working with Indigenous families and advocating for Indigenous families in whether they choose to have a home birth or whether they choose to go into the hospital. There's also, the Indigenous doula program that's available through the BC Friendship Centers. And if you're an Indigenous family, you can go onto the BC Friendship Center website and apply for a grant, and a doula will be supplied to your family. And a doula is someone that's able to sort of help and coach you through the prenatal process, the birthing process, and then the postnatal process. And some of them who work with Indigenous families advocate for you within the hospital or for the home birth as well. So, there are some accessible options, but you have to know about them. You have to know that there's these programs out there. You have to be able to access and have the ability to access, like going on a website and, applying for programs and, being connected into the networks. And if you don't know that, then it's a lonely world. You're going into the healthcare system without an advocate, without anybody, and being exposed to the rampant discrimination that's within those systems.
Okay, so let's chat for a minute about the Plain Sight report.
Yes,
because this was an important report that was done, and it really, I guess, can you explain what the Plain Sight report is, and how are we doing with the recommendations from the report?
Right. So I always say that any change that happens in the province or in this country in regards to equity for Indigenous peoples is always Indigenous led. It's not because the province or the federal government wakes up one morning and says, oh, we need to do what's right in regards to Indigenous peoples. No, that's never happened. I hope that it does in our lifetime and in future generations. However, all of that change is always Indigenous led. So the crux of why the In Plain Sight report came about in BC was because Indigenous leaders had been advocating for change within the healthcare system for decades. And so Indigenous leaders came together, advocated, and finally the province said, okay, we'll fund this a report where we can collect data that will show or may not show that there is discrimination within the healthcare system. So that's how that report came about. It's called In Plain Sight. It sort of collected thousands of stories from Indigenous peoples around British Columbia about their experience in the healthcare system. And so if you're interested in learning about more stories, that's a great resource to go to. Go to In Plain Sight. There's like several stories of everyday Indigenous people's experience within the healthcare system, and then a list of recommendations for change. I haven't seen a report that's come out to say this is how good we're doing. Like the province and the federal government, they like to pat themselves on the back when they are working towards change. And quite frankly, we haven't seen that report come out or a press release touting that they've implemented A, B, C, and D out of the recommendations. So where are we at with that? And I think that's a pattern. There's not only In Plain Sight, there's hundreds of reports that are out in regards to the discrimination of Indigenous people in the healthcare system. And so I think that we have to start moving from collecting data and doing reports and funding these reports to actually start moving into action, like the recommendations. And that's where I think we are as a country, is we're becoming aware. We're collecting, we've been collecting data for decades. And now we have to really move from, the frozen state of, okay, yeah, we know this is here. We're collecting data, to actually starting to implement these Indigenous-led recommendations. And I think that that's where there's some paralysis within the provincial and federal governments, is they don't know how. Why don't they ask Indigenous women now? Because there's deeply ingrained beliefs that we as Indigenous peoples don't know, and that there's this sort of old parental, patriarchal way of being with Indigenous peoples that, they need to be taken care of through the Indian Act, through our legislation. And so that takes a long time to break down that way of thinking. And that's why the education pieces are so important, right? Of learning about the roots of where this started from, and starting to unpack our own conditioning as individuals around how we think about Indigenous peoples, how we refer to them, and being able to unlearn some of that incorrect information.
But in the meantime, we have, Indigenous people going to hospitals and accessing healthcare like we all are. And there's, rampant discrimination. So it's not like we don't have any more time. It's like you said, right? Okay, we've got the data. We know what's happening. Let's move on. I really do feel like we're in this time where there are more women at the table who are, we don't like to mess around. We just want to get it done because we got more stuff to do. And so I feel like when it has, the lens of an Indigenous woman talking about healthcare for Indigenous peoples is necessary. And also, we're done with the data. We need to get on with the show here. Let's get going here. We know what the problem is. So, before I talk about your experience, I just want to mention that we like to give back. This is something new since you've been on the podcast. And so we asked our guests to choose a registered Canadian nonprofit that we can give $500 to in your name for you being here and your time here. And you chose the Orange Shirt Society. I'm glad you did. Phyllis Webstad is a pretty incredible person. And we will be giving the Orange Shirt Society $500. So thank you for choosing them, Chastity.
Thank you for the generous gift. I think that Phyllis is, you're talking about Indigenous women being leaders, and she literally took her experience as an Indigenous woman, residential school survivor, and changed that into a national movement. So that's the strength, resiliency, knowledge, power of Indigenous women. That if Canada can start to see that, then and include Indigenous women in the policy and legislative changes that need to happen in this country, then, that's an example. Phyllis is an example in the Orange Shirt Day, and society is an example of an amazing matriarch that's created a national movement through her orange shirt.
Yeah.
Right?
She's something else for sure.
Yeah.
She is a special person.
She is.
So when we talk about discrimination and, healthcare, maternal care, and so you just had a baby, beautiful baby boy. He's just a few months old, and you had your baby in a hospital. Did you experience any form of discrimination or racism, or was it just a wonderful? I mean, I'm really thoroughly interested because I can't imagine, and now I know you, and now you're my friend, and I don't want to get mad, and and I feel like your experience was not how I wish it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would definitely say that, we received discrimination during our birth. And, we chose to go through midwives, like to have a midwife team and a doula, but to have a hospital birth because I am in my latter 30s and having my first child. So as a couple, as my husband and I, when we talked about what we wanted the birth to look like, we wanted to make sure that, we were in a safe space. And so when I met and shopped around for a midwife team, I said, my biggest concern is the racism in the healthcare system. And when I talked to my non-Indigenous friends about their biggest concern about birth, they were like, oh, we've never thought about that. Like, we're like thinking about other things with birth, but like, that's my biggest concern was the racism in the healthcare system. So how are we going to do that? Because I'm going to be in a pretty vulnerable state, right? Going into labor, and we planned to just like have a natural birth, which ended up not happening. So we were turned away from the hospital that we went to when I was 10 days post. So 10 days over, which is like when you're in the latter part of your 30s, pregnant, and I had like 10 nights of labor. So it started at 10 p.m. and would stop at 6 a.m. So I wasn't in what I guess they say is an active labor, because I was stopping, but I had like 10 nights of that, and then 2 full days of like where I was having contractions. So we went to the hospital to try and get induced, to try and get like the help to finish the birth. And so they told us that we weren't a priority. And after they checked us in and told us that, that we would be seen and that we would get the health care, they came back down like an hour later and said that we weren't a priority and to go home. So here we are.
To Williams Lake?
It was in Vancouver that we to do the birth, right? But they were you're not a priority. Like, well, like, get back in touch. So
okay, so Chastity, I know that there will be other women that are listening and they're like, oh yeah, that happened to me too. I went and they said that I was here too early. I went back.
Yeah.
It's fine. This happens.
Yeah. And I think that it does. Like we talked about how there's gaps in the healthcare system. However, when we're talking about Indigenous families that are accessing healthcare, are trying to access the healthcare system, it's different because of the rampant discrimination and the history of racism. Like, so, and I think that that's something that, as we become more educated and learn about, and we start to hear these everyday experiences that are happening for Indigenous families, that's why it's different. Because we were sent home because we were an Indigenous family, because we weren't a priority, not because, there's a gap in the healthcare system. And so we had to, make some phone calls to some higher ups and 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 try, and because like our midwives and our didn't have weren't able to get us in, so we had to take the situation into our own hands and make some phone calls to some higher ups, and finally we got admitted. However, once we were admitted and we went through, like I said, I ended up going into having a C-section, and I was 2 weeks post by that time. And so our son was born through C-section. He was like close to 2 feet long, and he was 11 pounds, 3 ounces.
Oh, baby boy.
So he came out like warrior size.
Oh, baby boy.
But the discrimination that we got from that was unbelievable. Like, oh yeah, it's because mom ate too much sugar during pregnancy. He's going to fail all of his blood sugar tests. He's going to fail. Yeah. And then when we were in the recovery room, like the nurse is coming in and just being like, have you ever even been out of bed yet? And I'm, yeah, like a couple hours after the surgery. Just like the treatment.
The C-section I had one. It is so painful.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. There's no hopping out of bed right away.
Right? Yeah.
No.
So, just comments and experiences.
Yeah. It was just constant. And you were already, listen, you're 2 weeks overdue. And the internal stress of that, never mind what your body's going through, right? Building a human being.
Yes.
And now your body's in overdrive because you're 2 weeks overdue. And yeah, I mean, on every cell in a woman's body who, is just given birth you are a fragile being when you've just given, the miracle of birth, right? And it's like anything that is said to you it stays with you forever in those times, right? I find it interesting, Chastity, because talking of the things you've just said about the birth of your son and that is very similar to having, I hear a lot of similarities when I gave birth to my son, right? My son was born with a disability, and it's very similar, right? The discrimination, a lot of the things that you're saying are hitting me in a place that I wasn't aware of, and it's this almost, we've forgotten our humanity at times, right? When it comes to healthcare and caring for people, and the fact that you are judged. And I know what your husband looks like. He's a strong Indigenous man, right? Like, that Joe is an Indigenous man when he walks in the room.
Yes.
Of course you were judged. Of course you were. There can't be anybody listening that is like, well, this happens to everybody. No, but Chastity and Joe walking into a room, everybody in the room knows that you're Indigenous.
Yeah.
And so you were faced with racism and discrimination. How do you recover from that?
Well, I think part of it is like sharing our story, like something like that. Joe and I, have been advocates for our entire careers. And I think that part of that is about sharing our story. And part of that is about realizing that, we had connections to call. And and my husband said that in the hospital, like, this is a shame. This is a disgrace, he said to the healthcare providers, that we had to call people to be admitted into this hospital. What about 99.9% of the other Indigenous families that come through here that don't know who to call? What is their experience? And so I think part of my life experience has been about shifting the energy of these experiences into something positive. So transforming this energy of that's negative and discriminatory. And so how do we take that and transform that energy into something positive? And that's where the advocacy comes in. And I think that that's why Joe and I are now going to be sharing our story and going to be advocating for change for Indigenous women who are pregnant, Indigenous families that are going through this experience, that we want to see real change. We're not just sharing our story for the sake of sharing our story. We want to see real change. We want to see policy changes within the hospitals that prioritize Indigenous families. And that speaks loud and clear to that also uplifts the Indigenous health care teams within those institutions so that they're able to advocate for Indigenous families, right? And so just like we have we want to see that change happen. And I think that that's part of the recovery for a family like me and Joe and our son, Chinook, is about like, this has been our experience, and how do we use that experience to create positive change, not for all Indigenous families in British Columbia and Canada, because it's unacceptable. The healthcare system and the way that it discriminates against Indigenous people is unacceptable.
Yeah, and it's a shame.
Yeah, it's a shame.
It's pure shame.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Chastity, you and I can talk for weeks, days, months, years about all kinds of topics. I loved having you back here, and I can't wait to see you and baby Chinook and Joe soon. Yes. As always, you can find Chastity on her website. It is chastitydavis.com. And she's also on Instagram at @chastity_Davis. Chastity, you're amazing. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Tamara. It was wonderful to see you again, and appreciate the work that you're doing to create space for these not only discussions with Indigenous people, but to bring light to mainstream issues. And so I just want to raise my hands to you and in the change that you're making for our province and our country. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Chastity. Thanks for listening to another episode of TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Be sure to subscribe so you can join us every Tuesday for another conversation. You can also check out our website, telus.com/podcast, and subscribe to our YouTube channel @TELUS Talks.